Hey, it's Scott Lips, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Spin Magazine's Lip Service. My next guest is not only the drummer in Garbage, he is a legendary producer that has produced some of the biggest records that has changed music culture in the last 30 years, like Nirvana, Nevermind, to the Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream. He is Butch Vig. Coming up in a moment, my interview with Butch Vig.
Scott, how are you? Nice to be here.
I'm good. Great to have you here. I'm so excited to get into it. We're going to talk about the new Garbage record, the tour, your history, and everything in between. Butch, it's so funny. I feel like I kind of manifested this because I had the guys from Silver Sun Pickups on, Brian and Nikki were on the show, and they were like, you got to get Butch on the show. He'd be great on this. You guys would really get along. I'm like, that'd be great. So, of course, I'm sure you don't check your DMs, but I feel like I sent you a DM, and then I'm walking down the street in New York. I just moved back there about 2 weeks ago. And sure enough, or a month ago, whenever it was,
we ran into each other on the sidewalk.
So I feel like I put it out there in the universe. You were with your wife and your daughter looking at schools, I guess, right?
Yeah. It was a great trip.
Amazing. Do you like going back to New York?
I do, and obviously hadn't been there for a while, pre-COVID. I think the last time I was there was probably 2018 or so. And my wife loves New York, and my daughter wants to go to NYU. So she likes New York a lot, too. Whether that happens or not, we don't know. But we went and visited a bunch of schools in New York City. It was great.
Awesome. It's funny. I ran into like a block away from where I moved. So the likelihood of that happening is so strange because I live in Tribeca. But a lot to get into. Like I said, you were just telling me you were doing some Garbage rehearsals for the new record, the new tour coming up. I know drumming is a little bit in the sort of the last of things that you consider yourself. I'm a drummer, so it's something I want to get into with you, some of the drumming stuff. But more importantly, I want to take it back to the beginning, Butch, and where it all started, back to Madison and Wyoming, where you all started. So talk to me about like how you grew up, your parents. I think your mom was a music teacher early on.
Yeah, I grew up in a musical household. My mom played piano and trumpet and sang. She had an amazing voice. She sang at people's weddings and any sort of get-together. And she really exposed me to a lot of music growing up. Like she bought Beatles records, and she'd play them next to the Tijuana Brass and Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole. I was inundated with being in a small town, Viroqua, in Wisconsin. I was inundated with country music, polka music. I know how to play a mean polka, man. I played in a polka band in college. I got $200 cash every gig I played. It was awesome.
Amazing.
It was so good.
Did you ever produce a polka band, by the way?
There were a couple polka bands that came through Smart back in the day. And the band that I played with, Cliff Benz and the Polketeers, we recorded a couple songs at our studio just for fun. I don't think he ever put them out, but it was a good gig, man. $200 cash.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so I played piano for about 5 years, and it's like fifth or sixth grade, I got interested in drums, and I begged my mom and dad to buy me a drum kit, and they bought me a cheapo drum kit, and I just started practicing all the time, and really got into rock and roll. And the great thing is, my parents always really supported me in whatever. My dad was a small-town doctor. He was hoping I'd get a real job, like a lawyer or a doctor or go into business or whatever. But he came around eventually.
It's funny because you were talking about your mom being into the Beatles, the Stones, even stuff like Thelonious Monk, polka, obviously.
Yep.
But it wasn't until you really saw The Who that you decided this is something I want to do. And I think that your piano teacher was fairly strict from what I heard. So it was like, all right, drums seem like definitely not, someone's not going to be hitting me with a stick or whatever it may be.
Oh, you probably read that in another interview. Yeah, my piano teacher was sort of like that old Russian school, like really strict. And if you made a mistake, you get your knuckle rapped,
Right.
So I was kind of terrified of her.
I would be.
I remember, though, when I took I think it was sixth grade, and I took the final recital of that year or whatever, and I knew I was going to stop playing piano, but my mom thought I was going to keep playing, and the piano teacher did. But when I gave that last recital, I remember just going, I am out of here, thinking that to myself, and I was.
That's funny. And so the music that shaped you growing up, we talked a little bit about the Beatles and the Stones, but also the Clash. I think you were president of the Roxy Music fan club, great band. So talk to me a little bit about all your influences growing up and what really obviously Keith Moon, such an incredible drummer, some of the things that really got you into playing music early on, besides the polka.
Well, yeah, I wanted to be Keith Moon and realized very quickly I am not Keith Moon. But I could play like Ringo or Charlie in the Rolling Stones, and those are kind of the two of the bands I listened to a lot when I was, putting headphones on and jamming along to albums. When I went to the University of Wisconsin, I'd been playing in bands, and I met Duke in a band called Spooner, and he's the guitarist in Garbage. That's also where I met Steve Marker, a guitarist in Garbage, who we started Smart Studios. And I think growing up, I had sort of looked at all those records I listened to as like they were on a different level, like Jimmy Page and the Beatles, and they were to a certain extent. They were rock gods, untouchable. They were on this pedestal. And then punk and new wave happened, and I was like, I can be like those guys.
Yeah.
And I really started listening to the sound of those records. That's around that time is when I got interested in recording. And the band we were in, Spooner, started making EPs and singles, and we did a self-produced album that was on an indie label. And I really got active in the studio, asking the engineers questions like, why are you miking the snare this way, or why are you miking the guitar this way? I just really was fascinated by it. And slowly it just evolved into that was my passion. I don't think I really realized it until I finished college. I got a degree in film at the university, and there was a point where I thought, should I move to LA and try to get into the film industry? But I was really enjoying being in bands in the Madison scene. And then Steve Marker and I decided for some idiotic reason to open a recording studio.
What was the scene like back then in Madison? Was there a scene? Were there local bands around there that you would record eventually? What was it like?
Madison's always had a good scene. The university is big. It's 50,000 students. So every year you get 15,000 freshmen who come in. A lot of them are musicians, and a lot of them start bands. And a lot of cool clubs and cafes in Madison. And there was a healthy, like, sort of new wave punk scene at the time. And there really wasn't a studio back in 1984 when we opened the studio that sort of catered to that indie DIY scene. And we rented a space in a warehouse, and I think we charged like $20 an hour to go in and record. And we would just go to these all-ages shows and watch bands and go, oh, that band's pretty cool, and just go up afterwards and say, hey, man, you want to come and record our studio? Just buy a reel of tape and come on by. It's $20 an hour, and you can pay us later, whatever, And
$20 an hour, incredible.
And we got busy really fast right away.
And so it's funny because you grew up in Madison, and you initially were thinking about moving to LA to be in the film business. But at some point, you start recording all these bands. And what was the first band that really sort of clicked for you, where you felt like this was really working for me? Because you recorded hundreds of bands early on, right? Hundreds,
probably thousands of bands. Back in the day, from like 84 to 91, I just worked 6 or 7 days a week. And it was a good experience to do that because we did everything. We recorded everything. And anybody who wanted to book the studio was great. Was an opera singer, country western, a folk singer. And there were some hip-hop bands in Madison. Blues guitarists would come in. The Wisconsin marching band came in to record some songs. That was a tester.
Are there any bands that made it from Madison, by the way? I feel like I can't recall any band that...
I mean, I guess, obviously, Garbage is Shirley's from Scotland, but that was our home base. There were a couple bands that sort of were pretty big on the local scene, but never, I guess, really caught on the major label, that sold a lot of records. There were some from Wisconsin, though, the Violent Femmes. Yeah. Steve Miller lived in Wisconsin for a while. Ben Sidran was a great jazz pianist. Sure. He's from Madison. The band that really sort of made a name for me was a band called Killdozer, and they were on an indie label called Touch and Go, and they're a god-awful sound. Their songs sound like you're falling down the stairs in slow motion, and Mike Gerald, the singer, his voice is like 2 octaves lower than mine, like this. And they played these sort of weird, stumbling, polyrhythmic grooves, and Mike wrote really funny lyrics. And so the production was pretty simple, but I always mixed his voice really loud and kind of confrontational, which is not what punk bands did. Yeah, sure. You'd always bury the vocals, turn the guitars up super loud. Anyway, it was one of their records that I made, 12-Point Buck, that Kurt Cobain heard and Billy Corgan heard from the Pumpkins, and that's why they came calling, because they liked the sound of those Killdozer records.
Yeah, why do you think that band sort of resonated with both of them? Because it wasn't a band that had commercial success at that point. How did they find Killdozer? I feel like it wasn't, interesting. Well, I know Kurt was into all kinds of stuff, so obviously he was probably seeking out the indie bands that were really underground at that point. But how did they all come to you early on?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Touch and Go was a small label, and they maybe would press 4,000 or 5,000 copies of the record, that would go out to around the country to indie record stores. And they didn't even get that much airplay on like college radio because they were just, Killdozer was just such a nasty sound. But somehow those guys heard them. And I think they just liked the sound of the record, even though the records were kind of sludgy. I have this thing I always tell artists, I want the recordings to be really focused. Doesn't matter what the arrangement is like or the production. I want to hear all the parts. I want all the parts to work together, whether it's the Foo Fighters or Green Day or Garbage or it's Killdozer or whatever. All the parts need to make sense. And so I think there was, even into the sound of the dirge of Killdozer, there was some clarity in what we were doing and what the record sounded like. And I know that's why Billy Corgan called, because he liked the sound of those records.
Yeah, I was going to say, so you get this call from Billy Corgan. He's like, hey, I love this record you did. Let me come meet you. So talking about kind of that early meeting with Billy, I think you said the band walked in and they looked so cool. So I was reminiscing about what the Pumpkins looked like back in the day. Billy had long hair. He was wearing jewelry. It was a different thing back then, right? Darcy was in the band.
Darcy was in the band. James, they showed up on a Saturday morning at Smart, and we were scheduled just to record 2 days. It was for a single. I think it was going to be a Sub Pop single. And, they drove up in the band from Chicago, opened the door, and they're standing there, and I go, wow, Smashing Pumpkins. And they look cool as shit. I mean, they just did. Darcy, pale,
great.
really long blonde hair. James looked really cool. They looked exotic to me as a band. And they went in and started playing and just warming up, and I just realized right away, wow, they're incredible sounding, incredibly powerful. And we just did 2 songs, I think it was Tristessa and La Dolly Vita, which were the tracks that we did that became that first single. And I was blown away by them as musicians and Billy's songwriting. And Billy and I really clicked. He had a vision, and I think right away we realized that we were really good for each other. We had a good symbiotic relationship. Like I could really push him, and he could really push me, and it worked.
It's funny, I was just watching something that Billy was talking about, the fact that you wore a vest every time you'd record with him early on. So you I guess that made it made it more official or something early on, right? So
he makes fun of me. It is true. I used to wear like J. Crew t-shirts, and then I thought, well, I'm a record producer. I should at least dress up somehow, and I would wear just this black vest over it. Yeah. It was either a t-shirt or we would go to the thrift shop, and like back in the day, I had lots of flannel shirts, so I'd put a flannel shirt on, then put a black vest over it, and I was kind of dressed up.
Hey guys, today's episode of the show is brought to you by the all-new DLZ Creator by Mackie. The DLZ Creator is an adaptive digital mixer designed for podcasting and streaming, and it's what I'm using right now to make this very own podcast. What makes it so special? DLZ's Mix Agent technology takes all the hard parts out of making your podcast. It's amazing. It's easy to use. You have 3 selectable user modes from easy to enhanced to professional. DLZ allows creators to any experiences to make content of their own terms. With features like Setup Assistant, Audio Mix, Mackie has taken 30 years of audio legacy and packed all their expertise into a podcasting mixer that is not only top of the line, but incredibly easy to use. You can find out more about DLZ Creator at Mackie.com. Check it out, the amazing DLZ Creator. Early on, you've always had this incredible relationship with drummers, being that you're a drummer. So Jimmy Chamberlin and your connection, it's always been an incredibly powerful one. Talk to me about your relationship with Jimmy. As a drummer, I can tell you one of my biggest influences, and so incredible. I mean, it's sort of like this tribal feeling when you hear Jimmy. You listen back to Gish and those early records, and it's like no other drummer I'd ever heard at that point. And the rolls and all the fills that he was doing. So what did you see early on in sort of his playing that kind of resonated with you?
Well, I used to get a call at least once a year from Taylor Hawkins saying, he'd text me, I'm listening to Gish. It just still blows my mind. It blows my mind. He was such a fan of Jimmy's drumming and the sound of that record. Taylor, rest in peace, man. I'm still, I heard a Foos song on the way here in the car, and it just breaks my heart that he's not with us, Yeah,
I want to get into that too.
Jimmy Chamberlin has jazz chops, and he can play a variety of styles. I think the thing that I find exciting about his music, the way his approach to the drums, is he has this sort of push-pull. I don't even think we really used any click tracks, maybe on 1 or 2 songs, and I don't think we did any on Gish, and maybe we did on a couple on Siamese Dream. I think we did at least one on Siamese Dream. Anyway, it's better to let him just play because he's got this push-pull, and the way he plays with Billy on guitar, they sort of it's also very symbiotic, and it's like the front of the bar pushes and then it pulls back at the end of the bar and then it pushes forward again. It's just something I noticed. It gets very hypnotic in the way he plays and the way they play as a band, and yeah, he's just incredible. And I was lucky enough in my band 5 Billion and Diamonds, we recorded an extra song for the vinyl release that came out last year of our album Divine Accidents. We wrote this song called A Thin Line, and I had programmed a beat on the drum machine. And I was like, am I going to play this or what? And I kept listening to it, and all of a sudden a light bulb, eureka moment went off in my head. That's a Jimmy Chamberlin groove. Yeah. And I texted him and said, I have this song with my side band, 5 Billion and Diamonds. You interested in playing? He goes, send it to me. So I sent him a wave file. And the next morning I woke up in my Dropbox and the drums were done, and he'd done an incredible take. And it's totally, it was right, just the way it was like a 6/8, just amazing. And he nailed it. So cool.
It's also the first time I would say that, drums were like a hook of a song that I can remember. Obviously, you went on to work with, we were talking about Taylor and Dave. All those guys write hooks. And as being a drummer, it's so incredible to hear that record when you listen back to it. The drums were as much of a hook as like the lead guitar at that point, right?
Totally, and I love drummers that realize that, because it's great if you want to express your chops every time with a new fill when you're going to the chorus or coming out of the chorus or the bridge or whatever. But when you write parts, kick and snare patterns or tom patterns, and then you come up with these little motifs, whether it's the groove or a drum fill, it just makes the strong better. Listen to Nevermind. Listen, every single fill on that record, Dave Grohl figured out, and there's a reason that it was that way. He wanted it to be a hook, and he would repeat it over and over and over.
Yeah, and when you listen to Chad on their earlier records and then Dave Grohl, the sound of the band changes dramatically, obviously. But let's talk a little bit about Gish. I mean, obviously it opened up so many doors for you. Was there drama involved when you made the record? Did it go smoothly? How did it go for you?
Well, Gish went pretty smooth, but I realized right away that Billy wanted to play most of the instrumentation because, honestly, he's just a notch up than... Well, he couldn't play the drums. Jimmy played the drums, and Darcy and James would track, but they played very little on the record on that end. Siamese Dream, Billy went back and overdubbed most of the parts because he could play the bass and lock it in like better than Darcy could, even though Darcy is a great bass player. Yeah. And Billy also heard things in his head a very specific way. So, and that caused some tension. I mean, they were a band. They'd go out and play the songs live, and they sounded incredible. But in the studio, there was tension. It really escalated more, though, on Siamese Dream, because then they were also feeling pressure to have a hit album, to have this album that sort of took them to another level, especially after I did Gish and then did Nevermind, which exploded. The weight of the world was on the band's back when we went in to do Siamese Dream.
Yeah, talk to me about that a little bit. So obviously you go on, you do Gish, and then you get a call at some point to do Nevermind. So I think initially for that record, they'd wanted to work with another producer, and the label was trying to get someone else to do it. I don't know who that producer was at this point, but definitely they were going to work with someone else early on for that record, right? Did we ever find out who was scheduled to do that record early on?
There were a bunch of people on a list. I remember because I talked to Chris Novoselic about it, and I think one was Don Dixon, who'd worked with R.E.M., I think maybe Ed Stasium. Neil Young's producer, his name escapes me right now, who mixed all Neil's stuff. What's his name? Damn. And the band met with like 3 or 4 different producers, and they just didn't like him. They didn't click. And I think maybe because I had done the Smart Sessions before with them when Chad had drummed with them, that they felt comfortable, and most of it coming from sort of a punk pedigree, that maybe they felt a little more safe.
Yeah.
The label was not very happy about my choice. But at the 11th hour, I got a call from Chris and said, we just want to work with you. Are you up for it? I go, yes, I am. And they said, well, can we do it next week? I'm like, okay, sure. I can clear my schedule out. And I said, is there any way I can hear some songs? Yeah, so I said, I'd like to have some pre-production time so I can go in and just, I know you got a new drummer, and I'd like to hear what the songs are, and we can finesse the arrangements and stuff. And they said, sure, but they didn't want to spend more than like 3 or 4 days doing that. Sometimes you go in with a band and you work for a month on pre-production until the songs are done. Anyway, and a couple days later, I got a cassette in the mail, and I put it in, and it's Kurt saying, hey, Butch, we're going to play some new songs, and we got the best drummer in the world. His name is Dave Grohl. Take it away. And then they clicked into Teen Spirit, and it just distorted. It was recorded on a boombox with the built-in microphones, which has this compressor, and as soon as you kick in, it just shreds, so distorted. But I could hear how powerful he was, and that's where I heard Come As You Are, and I heard Teen Spirit. I heard a lot of the songs on that album for the first time. So I knew they'd written something special.
You still have that cassette, by the way?
I do, yeah.
That cassette is worth a lot of money at this point.
Still sounds like shit, though.
So the first time you actually saw them, I think, was at like a pizza place, like right near where you lived, right, in Wyoming?
In Wisconsin. Yeah. They there's an Italian place called Bunky's, which is like an Italian restaurant. Downstairs was like a little cafe pizza parlor that held maybe 100 people or so, and this was during the Smart Sessions. They decided to play a gig in the middle of the week, or like on a Thursday night, and there was a good crowd. There were like 60 or 70 people. People, had in the local scene kind of knew about Nirvana. I think they'd put out a couple Sub Pop singles, and Bleach was out at that point, so they definitely had a following. And they were awesome, man. They sounded so good, and I've never seen someone sing so hard. Kurt completely blew his voice out. Wow. He couldn't even finish the set. They just sort of jammed on 3 or 4 songs, and Chris was yelling in the mic. They'd had a few cocktails during the show, and we went in the studio the next day. We were supposed to finish some songs, and Kurt couldn't sing. He couldn't even talk.
Wow.
So I said, well, why don't I just rough mix the stuff we have, and we'll just figure a time you guys to come back, because they were going out to play more shows in the Midwest, and then I didn't hear anything for weeks and weeks, and I called Jonathan Poneman, the head of Sub Pop, one of the heads of Sub Pop, and he said, yeah, we want to come in like in August or whatever the date was, but now the band is interested in signing to a major label. That's all he said. And it turns out I had sent them a cassette of the rough mixes, and they put it in one of those dubbing boom boxes, and they made 100 copies and gave them out to all their friends.
They bootlegged themselves.
Much to the anger of Sub Pop. It's like, here's our new Sub Pop album. Now everybody's got it and is playing it,
By the way, when you first heard Teen Spirit, or you first saw them at that first gig, what went through your head? I mean, you were like, is this a band that's going to change culture? This is the band that's going to change the face of music?
Well, the first time I heard Teen Spirit was the first song they played in North Hollywood rehearsal studio, and Dave walked up and goes, "Hey, Butch, I'm Dave. Nice to meet you." And I go, "Cool, man." And it was a pretty big room they were set up in, and I noticed there were no mics on Dave's kit, and Kurt had a big Mesa Boogie system set up on his guitar, and Chris had his SVT bass rig, and they're both really loud. I'm thinking, maybe should I put a kick and snare mic on the drums and run them through the wedges? And Dave goes, nah, you don't need it. And they kicked into Teen Spirit, and they played so ferociously, and Dave hit the drums so effing loud. I was just like, oh my God. But the hair in the back of my neck went up because the song was so good.
Yeah.
And I remember I had a notebook, and I was pacing around the room, and they finished it, and the sound, the cymbals all sort of, the sound just died down, and Kurt said, what do you think? I go, play it again. It's awesome. Play it again. Just let me collect my thoughts. I hadn't written down any notes at all. I was just sort of blown away by it. And then I started taking notes on the songs, little tweaky things just to tighten up the arrangements and things. But man, they were good and so tight. I didn't know this until later that they had practiced pretty much every single day for 6 months before they came down to make Nevermind. So they were pretty focused.
Because early on you had worked with them with Chad. At that point, did you think this is the same band, or this band has taken another level with Dave at that point?
Well, I could kind of tell in that boombox recording because they sounded super tight, even though it was distorted. Yeah, you could just hear the feel of the band, and that's where I heard some of the new songs. So I know that Kurt had really upped his game in terms of melodic sensibility. He was writing these anthems, but he was writing super hooky, all the melodies, and just that's one of the reasons that record is so successful. The songs are really, really hooky.
Definitely. It's interesting. I was hearing this great story about the fact that you were telling Kurt early on, I want you to double the vocals. And he was like, listen, that's not us. Ultimately, you talked to him about the Beatles and Lennon, and really said to him, look at what John Lennon did. And that's kind of how you got him to agree to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, at first Kurt said he wanted to record the band au naturel. Let's just record it live. I'll set up in a vocal booth. Let's keep it all live. And I said, it's just going to sound like a live recording. You know, when you go into the studio, you use the studio and the tools available to make an album sound larger than life, to make it sound widescreen. You do that by adding harmonies and doubling vocals and doubling guitars and compression and EQ and effects and things like that. And he's like, oh, you know, whatever. But the first day when I asked him to double track his vocal, he said, I don't really want to do that. I just think it's fake. And I said, well, John Lennon did it on pretty much everything he sang. And then there's just a pause. And then Kurt said, okay, let's do it. I told him that John Lennon doubled all of his vocals. And he paused for a moment, and then he looked at me and said, okay, let's do it. And then we doubled at least all the chorus vocals on the record.
Do you think it was sort of him trying to stick with his punk rock kind of ethos? Like, I don't want to double the vocals, because ultimately all the bands I love, whether it be Fugazi or none of those guys would do something like that, right?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a punk ethic thing that he was grappling with. He didn't want to stray too far from his roots. But that was a strange dichotomy working within the band, within Kurt's head, because he wanted to be huge. He wanted to make a big record. He had drawn all these things of them playing the Enormo Dome with like 50,000 people watching them. You know, he was swinging for the fences, but constantly grappling with, I have to stay true to my punk authenticity. And that was, that haunted him through his whole career, through his whole life.
You know, I always bond with Courtney over the fact that we both love Cheap Trick, and I feel like they're one of the most underrated bands of all time. Even Courtney's manager, JD, who I'm very close with, we always talk about Cheap Trick. And it had been said that Kurt had said that Nirvana, that record in particular was like a souped-up version of a Cheap Trick record. Are you a Cheap Trick fan? I think one of the most underrated bands of all time, by the way.
I am a massive Cheap Trick fan, massive Cheap Trick fan. I've seen them probably play about 25 times over the last 30, 40 years, whatever it is. I love Robin Zander. It has to be the greatest rock vocalist in the world. I mean, he does not, his voice is not lessened at all. He brings it every time. And
he doesn't get the respect he deserves, by the way. I mean,
yeah, great band. Bunny Carlos, awesome drummer.
Amazing.
We years ago, we mixed a thing for this, I think it was an MTV spinoff called Reverb. They were having these live bands filming them, and then they'd mix it. And we were doing some of the mixing at Smart. And we mixed a Cheap Trick one, and the engineer, Doug Olson, and I were putting the tracks up, and he's listening to drums going, wow, the drums don't really sound that good. Solo up the bass, doesn't really sound that good. Put up the guitar, man, that sounds really scrappy. Put the vocal up, he just put all the faders up, and it sounded killer. It did not sound very good individually, and you just mix it up, just put them all up around zero, and it sounded godlike. It's just the way they played together, It was pretty incredible to hear that.
Yeah, I was asking you actually when you got here, was there ever any talk of you working with Courtney? And you had mentioned that there was a little bit of that early on, but that you never did, obviously.
No, when I was doing Siamese Dream in Atlanta, Kurt called a bunch of times, and he'd say, Butch, you got to do Courtney's next record. It's going to be great. She's got some great songs. And I was really deep in Siamese Dream, which was an extremely long, arduous record. And it was hard for me even to get my head about thinking about doing another album at the time. And so I go, well, let me I don't even know what the end date is on this, and I think I'm probably going to need a short break before I go into another record, but just let me think about it. And then I would hang up and tell Billy Corgan that. They ended up working together. Yeah, they wrote songs together. Yeah.
Amazing songs, by the way.
That was Live Through This, right? And wasn't that the record that they went in then and recorded in the same studio that the Pumpkins had gone in?
Yeah.
And the songs are great on that record. One thing I really love now, my daughter is 17, Bo, and she is starting to get into some of the alt rock stuff from the 90s, and she's a Courtney fan. She loves a bunch of the songs.
Amazing.
Doll Parts and some of the tracks from Celebrity Skin. Yeah, it's cool.
Well, let's talk about this for a minute. So you end up doing, just rewinding a second, you do Nevermind. It becomes the record that blew it all up for you. Obviously, so many bands came to you, so many labels. Butch has the Midas touch. Every band wanted you to work with them. Were there any bands that you had to turn down at that point because you went on to do Siamese Dream, but any bands that you kind of regret at that point turning down because you just couldn't work with everyone at that point, right?
It got kind of silly because I think, like you pointed out, Scott, a lot of managers or A&R people or publishing people thought, oh, here's this new thing, and I have some sort of magic formula I could sprinkle on to an artist and change them into a band that sounds like Nirvana.
Any genre.
Yeah, and it was any genre. And so I started getting blues artists and country artists. I'm not kidding. And you know, fairly big names. And I just, I was lucky. I kind of still just picked things that I wanted to do. I did a couple oddball projects at the time. I took on Freddie Johnston, a singer-songwriter who I love because I just loved his songwriting. I met him, and I'm still really good friends with him to this day. I turned down a lot of big bands. Probably the one that I was most intimidated about that I maybe should have done, but I turned down, was I did meet with Mick Jagger about working with the Rolling Stones. And I was intimidated because, as I said, I was playing along to you, learning how to play the drums, man. And
nice guy, by the way, though, Mick.
Yeah, now you want me to go produce you. And as it turns out, this is right when Garbage was starting out too, and just it's like if I would have had time on my schedule, I might have gone and at least try to record some songs. Like, let's go in and record 2 songs and see how it goes, you know. But I didn't have the time, so.
But you actually met with him.
I did, yeah.
How did it go? How was the meeting?
Well, he's friggin' Mick Jagger, man. He's the coolest. He's charming.
Yeah, he's great. My buddy called me some years ago. He's like, "Can you have dinner on Wednesday night?" I'm like, "I think I'm booked on Wednesday. What do you got?" He's like, "I want you to have dinner with Mick." I'm like, "Mick Jagger? Why am I having dinner?" And coolest guy ever, by the way. Amazing.
Yeah, you know, during COVID or last year, maybe 2 years ago now, Dave Grohl recorded a song with him that is a great track that they did during COVID. And I think Mick asked Dave to play drums on it, just sent the files over, and Dave did some drums as well as guitar, bass, and added backing vocals. And I think Dave put down about 30 more tracks on it. And Mick left them all in there when he mixed the song, and it's a really cool song.
It never came out, I don't think.
No, I think it did come out.
Oh, it did come out, okay.
I can't remember the title right now, but it came out about a year and a half ago, and Jagger's singing is fantastic, and the lyrics are great. We'll have to do a deep dive, and we can add it in. It's funny because when Dave texted me the track, he goes, check this out. Who is it? And I listened to it, and I wrote him back, that's whoever it is, they sound like a damn good Mick Jagger clone. And he goes, that is Mick. I was like, holy shit.
By the way, there's some rumblings that Mick is working with Paul McCartney and Ringo on this new record, so I'd love to hear what they come up with.
Yeah, I heard those rumblings too. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah, so talk me a little bit let's talk about Siamese Dream, obviously and I want to get into some of the lesser talked about records, Sonic Youth, Urge Overkill, so many great records that you worked on. But Siamese Dream in particular, another record that I think sort of changed your life, right? An incredible record. Took 5 months versus the 2 weeks or 16 days that Nirvana's Nevermind took. So that record in particular and the production technique was so lush, such an incredible record. When you listen back on it, fond memories?
Well, fond memories, yes.
Or challenging memories.
Challenging memories, yeah. I mean, I'm incredibly proud of that album. It was really hard work. Just the performances and how high we set the bar sonically, what we wanted to do. This was before Pro Tools, where it's very easy to sort of fix things and make things sound more perfect. And every note on that record had to be played. And there's a lot of layering and sonic tweaking going on both Billie and I did during the record. And I think we originally scheduled about 3 months, and then it ended up taking about 5 months to record. And the last 2 months, we worked 7 days a week. Like, I'd go in at noon and work till like 2 or 3 in the morning. And then we came out to LA to mix. We moved into Rumbo Recorders out in the Valley. And I thought it would be about 3 weeks, and that ended up being 6 weeks. And we brought in Alan Mulder to mix because we needed someone with a perspective, because Billie and I were so burnt out and had somewhat lost some of our objectivity, I think. And Alan was great, and we loved him because he'd worked with My Bloody Valentine, and Billie and I were both huge fans of that band. And Alan was perfect for us because he really got it. He's also just an incredible producer-engineer, and allowed Billie and me to step back and then come into the mix room and have a more firm opinion of what needed to be done. But we kidnapped him. Alan was supposed to be there 3 weeks, and we wouldn't let him go. And finally, the last day, he goes, I have to go. I'm going to get fired. I missed this thing, and da-da-da. And it was like a Friday or Saturday, and Billie and I well, I can mix the last song, whatever. And he took off, and we were bummed because, I mean, I think we mixed Lunar, one of the quiet songs, as the last thing, which was also a really easy mix to do. All the really dense tracks had been mixed at that point. But yeah, he was a star. But man, as I knew that it was going on and on and on, I took off about, I think it was almost a month or 3 weeks or 4 weeks that I went out to a friend's house in Palm Springs, and I just sort of laid out in his backyard and stared up at the stars every night for about 3 weeks, and I needed it.
To be fair, I mean, when you first started working with the Pumpkins and Gish, you were relatively unknown. The band was relatively unknown. I imagine the dynamic might have changed having done Nevermind. Did it change working on Siamese Dream? Because so much has happened between those few years, right?
There was a lot of pressure on the band, particularly on Billy Corgan, and we were supposed to start their record at least 6 months earlier, and I went down to Chicago and I heard them rehearse some of the songs in their rehearsal space, and I loved them. And Billy gave me a couple cassettes, but I hadn't heard everything. So we got in his car and started driving around in Chicago, like at 10 o'clock at night, and he'd start to play a song, and then he'd just turn it off. And I could see him thinking, I go, what? Just play it. Let me hear the song. He goes, no, I can't play it. It's not ready yet.
Like 10 seconds of the song?
Yeah. And so I go, that's really, you're not being very nice to me right now. You're torturing me. And there were about 7 or 8 songs like that he only played literally 10 or 20 seconds. And then I looked at him and said, so you're not quite ready. And he goes, I'm not quite ready. And then he kept writing for about, at least it was like 4 or 5 months. So we pushed the start of the record back. But that's where he wrote Cherub Rock. He wrote Disarm. Some of the key tracks on the record, like Rocket was done. I'd heard that one. I think he and James wrote the song Mayonnaise, which is at the end of the record, which I love. Soma, I think, was one of the songs. Anyway, he needed that time. And he also wrote Today, which became the big single on the record. And I think he knew, with all his expectations, he had to also push himself in terms of his songwriting.
Yeah, it's funny because you had worked with other bands. I had mentioned Urge Overkill before Gish, but really Gish was the record that sort of broke it through for you. So did you feel like a pressure? I heard Billy was talking about the fact that, you and him both wanted this record to be the record that really, made it for them ultimately, because coming off Nevermind, was there like a pressure that you felt like, I really want this record to succeed for them?
Yeah, I mean, I felt the pressure too, because everybody kept saying, oh, it's going to be huge, it's going to be massive. And that's before we recorded one note. You don't want people telling you that.
Well, coming off the last record, you can kind of understand why that would be, I guess.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So we sequestered ourselves and kind of went into isolation. We recorded a studio in the burbs of Atlanta, Triclops. So there was no record company around, and we didn't have friends from Chicago or Madison around. Although Jimmy, being Jimmy, at the time, he was kind of a bad boy, and within a few days, there's a parade of these drug dealers coming through the studio with a satchel. Like, what's in that satchel, dude? You got to get out of here. Guy
with a briefcase coming in every 10 minutes.
Yeah. I know, and Billy, James and Darcy had been a couple, and they were splitting up. There was tension. James and Darcy had been a couple, and they were splitting up, so there was tension between them. And there was tension between them and Billy was feeling a lot of pressure in terms of songwriting and performance. And I think he felt like the band wasn't necessarily 100% behind him. And Jimmy disappeared for like 3 days at the start. He went on a bender. So there were some rough patches. We had to have like an intervention at one point where the management and the label all came in, and we just everybody sat in the studio, and it was like screaming therapy. Everybody just unloaded all their bad feelings. It was hard to sit through that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Do you usually know when you do a record like that, or Nevermind, that, again, this is a record that's really going to change what's going on in music and culture, or sometimes you're not spot on with that stuff?
I don't know that I'm ever really aware of what kind of impact it'll have. Like when I finished Nevermind, I just knew the songs are really great, and I thought maybe it'll be as big as the Pixies, maybe they'll sell 500,000 copies. You just don't know. The same with Siamese Dream, because the Pumpkins are sort of a difficult band. The Pumpkins are kind of a difficult band to digest sometimes because they can be really heavy, really aggressive, kind of psychedelic, vulnerable. Like Billy's singing can be very feminine, even though sometimes the music can come across very testosterone. So a lot of things going on in their music, and they weren't really a top 40 band. I mean, today might have got on a few top 40 charts here and there, but it still had loud guitars in it. And back in the day, if you're in alt music, it was hard to sort of cross over into the mainstream. So we didn't really know what kind of success it was going to have, but I knew sonically it was going to be cool sounding, and I knew that they had really written some great songs. So then you just have to put it out there and see what happens.
Yeah, all those records still sound so relevant today when you go back and listen to them. So it's great. But some records that a lot of people don't talk about that you've done. Obviously, let's get into a little bit Sonic Youth. Obviously, let's talk about stuff. I know that you also worked on things like Soul Asylum, great record. So talk to me about your experience working with Sonic Youth and Soul Asylum early on, because a lot of people talk about Siamese Dream and Nevermind, but those are some records I feel like that don't get the due that they deserve.
Well, I love Sonic Youth. When I got a call to work with them, they had signed to Geffen, and I think probably because of the relationship, they might have helped bring Nirvana to Geffen. So I think they had some a little star power there. I had seen Sonic Youth play and loved the band, and when I got a call to go to New York to meet them, I was intimidated because I thought, wow, they're the coolest, the hipsters in New York. They're smart and arty, and I'm just a dumb kid from Wisconsin.
Right.
What am I? I'm going to meet these
indie rock darlings,
indie rock superstars,
yeah.
And they couldn't have been farther from that. When I met them, they were funny and self-deprecating and really outgoing, and I just fell in love with all of them right away. And the first couple of meetings we had, just talking about songs and how we wanted to record, we decided to do it in New York at the Magic Shop, which is a studio that's no longer there, but is a great one-room studio in Soho that which had this incredible British Neve console, a broadcasting console. It was a great experience. We had so much fun making that record.
You don't think about Sonic Youth and fun for some
reason. Because I think they trusted me also maybe the same way that Nirvana did, that I had come from a sort of a punk background and a lot of the production I had done. So as long as they could retain some of that in the music, and I knew they had to sound like Sonic Youth. So we worked hard. We doubled some guitars in terms of the sonics and things. I spent more time engineering, and I pushed them to get really good arrangements. It took me a while to sort of figure out how they play, because the tunings are so strange. It's not typical guitar tunings. I'd look at a rack of Thurston's guitars, and I'd look at the back of the headstock, and the strings would say like F sharp, D, D, D sharp, D sharp, F sharp. I go, how do you play with a tuning like that? But they sent me a bunch of cassettes of their rehearsals, and I listened to those, and some of them were like 10 or 15-minute, these jams, and I was like, whoa. So I kind of had to sort through those and go, I think this section right here from about the 3-minute mark to the 7-minute mark is really great. I think we should focus on that in this song. Some of the songs were shorter and a little bit more focused, I guess, like a rock or a pop song, but there were some epic songs on there. One of my favorite songs is Teresa's Sound World on that.
Sure.
On Dirty. I just love that. And that turned out to be a very hard song to record. We attempted it a couple times, and it always didn't kind of flow right or fell apart. And the night we actually tracked it in the studio, the engineer, Ed Douglas, is sitting next to me. We turned all the lights down low, and they started playing it, and I had it on the big speakers, and the hair on the back of my neck went up. I was like, this is it, I can tell. And it sounded so epic, the way the song builds. Do-do-doon, do-do-do-do, do-do-doon, do-do-doon. Starts out with this little arpeggio guitar, and Steve Shelley's playing mallets on the drums, and it just turns into this pulse. It sounds like an orchestra.
Yeah.
It's so powerful, and that's one of my favorite songs.
Well, fast forward a little bit. I want to talk to you a little bit about, we were reminiscing about Taylor Hawkins, what it was like to work with him. Obviously, you've gone to do some records with the Foos. So talk to me about the experience working with Taylor and the Foos and some of those records.
Well, I've known Dave Grohl. I've known Dave Grohl for a long time, since Nevermind. And over the years, when he started the Foos and I started Garbage, we played a lot of festivals together. I remember we played some show in Lisbon, And then Dave and Taylor and Duke and I and Shirley went out like club hopping at like 3 a.m. Bad idea. It was a rough day the next day just because we partied hard, man. Taylor is an incredible drummer. He is so sorely missed by Foos fans, but by everyone who knew him. He was a great father. He was Dave's best friend.
Yeah.
They were like brothers joined at the hip. And it's just a loss that I will probably never, Dave's never really going to recover from in some ways, but he's moving on. He wants to make music, and I think he has to make music, in order to be Dave Grohl. Taylor brought this incredible energy to the Foos that was so vibrant, and if in the studio it was so much fun because just of the back and forth banter between the band, particularly between Taylor and Dave, and there's some self-deprecation going on, not thinking they're too full of themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, both guys are like that. I mean, Dave's an incredible drummer too. That was the hardest thing for Taylor, I think. My boss is possibly better than me on drums,
I don't think I could ever be in a band with Dave Grohl. I mean, the intimidation of knowing whatever part you're going to play.
Yeah, Dave
is
can
being
play better.
Critiqued.
And Dave can play everything better.
Yeah.
The guitars, bass, whatever. He's that guy. He's so effing good.
I'm sure Taylor struggled with that a little bit, like as any drummer would.
Yeah, he had some insecurities, but he was just so good. And I think sometimes he probably overcompensated. He was constantly practicing, constantly playing.
Yeah.
He at home, he'd come in, hey Butch, let me show you these fills, and he'd play these crazy patterns and things like, oh, how did you figure that out, man? He really appreciated the technical ability of drummers. I mean, that's why he would call me listening to Gish.
Yeah.
Or text me every year. I can't believe how great Gish sounds. And Jimmy Chamberlin is just a monster. And I appreciated that when T would text me like that. So it's just I still can't believe he's gone. I have a picture of him in my studio at home that I see every day. I go down there and sit there, and he's just smiling at me from behind the kit.
Amazing.
But man, I miss him.
Yeah, when you work with an incredible drummer, I think we all miss him. But when you work with bands like the Foos or Nirvana or the Pumpkins, or whether it be, like I said, Sonic Youth, how does the production technique differ for you? Are there different techniques that you're using to work with different bands like that? Maybe there's overhead mics versus miking everything up close, or whatever, room mics versus whatever it may be. Are there different techniques that you're using, applying for each band?
Yeah, every drummer sort of has their own feel, and then within the context of an album, every song is different. If it's slow or quiet, if there's a lot of syncopation, or if there's a lot of accents on the cymbals and things, that sort of dictates how you engineer it, where you move the mics, what kind of mics you move, if you're going to EQ them or leave them flat. I'm lucky that I have worked with so many great drummers because that helps. That is easily a good, I won't say 50% of cutting a track, but it's a big percentage of, if you're recording a rock band, if the drum player, the rhythm section is good, because the feel is so important in rock and roll. Whether you want to have a push or you want to be groovy and have that sort of push-pull feeling, or whether you want to have space.
How often would you have to replace drummers on certain records? Or would you try not to do that?
I try not to do that. And I think it's only really only happened, I think, on one project that I can think. And really because the band sort of insisted that they wanted to make a change. So when I've worked with drummers who are not on the level of Dave Grohl or Taylor,
which is most drummers. So
well,
I guess,
yeah. I like when I did the first Against Me record, Warren played drums, and Warren is a great drummer. He had a great feel. He had kind of a cool shuffle swing thing, but he wasn't great at some of the rock stuff, and he was not very consistent tempo-wise. So we worked out tempo maps on it with a click track, and a tempo map is where I'll listen to them rehearse, and I'll mark down where I think that the BPM is good in the intro and where it is. So it doesn't have to, the song doesn't always have to be the same exact tempo all the way through. It can speed up in the chorus, it can slow down in the bridge or whatever in the verses. And so I make a tempo map, and then when they're tracking it live, I speed the click track up and down for these sections so the drummer can, I sort of adjust to where the drummer feels good. But then I also have, it's being cut to a click, so when I go and I start editing, I know where the sections are. It makes my job easier putting a track together. I know it sounds overly complicated, but we spent a lot of time on Warren's drums on a New Wave, and to the point where Laura Jane Grace is like, is there going to be enough budget to finish recording the record?
I still need to do vocals.
And Billy Bush, the engineer, we put in a couple long, like just went with some extra time on the weekends just getting the drums edited and all tweaked out. So we'd have plenty of time to finish all the overdubs. But yeah, I guess maybe because I'm a drummer, I feel sympathetic, like I want to give them the best, all the tools I have and do the best, to get the best performances out of them. And unless, of course, it's not working. And sometimes it's not even they're playing. Sometimes it's a chemistry thing. Personalities in the band are no longer working, But luckily, knock on wood, I've only really had to do that once. We had to replace a drummer.
I was going to say, I always wonder what Zeppelin would sound like to a click track because it changes the whole feel of a song. Some of the best records were not recorded to click tracks, but do you prefer the old school way to record, the knee boards and analog versus Pro Tools and digital these days? What do you prefer when you think about all the great records you made?
Well, I prefer great consoles to record with.
Like the Sound City board?
Sound City board, a Neve, or I love Trident boards, API boards. The 70s API boards are so great for rock records. But I prefer recording in a digital system. I love Pro Tools because I love the flexibility of editing and being able to take a song and go, let's take the first chorus and move it and start the song with a chorus and see what it sounds like. You just cut, boom, boom, a couple clicks on the keypad and you can hear it. If you like it or not, you don't like it, you hit Splat Z and you undo it and that's fine. When I first started recording all analog tape, I became the king of razor editing, tape razor.
Because people don't know, you used to usually have to take the tape and put it together. It was so hard, and the process is so different than it is now.
Yeah, a band would do 3 or 4 takes, and I go, take 2 is great, but I really like the outro fills you did on take 3, and actually the intro is best on take 4. So I'd say, you guys go across the street and get a beer and a grilled cheese, and I'm going to edit this together. And I would take all the, you'd pull out, like, you'd mark the start of the chorus and cut it all with a China, mark it with a China marker, and then cut it and have all these big chunks on nails in the room. Okay, there's verse 1 laying over there. There's the fills on the end over there. And then you have to assemble it all back together. And then you hold your breath and hit play and hope you didn't screw up, and I got really good at that. I guess that's why I like Pro Tools, because the editing is so much easier than doing tape editing.
Definitely. Well, fast forward, let's talk about Garbage. Obviously, the tour is coming up. You're just finishing the new record. The new record's coming out. I think this is your 8th record, right? This
is our 8th record, yeah. We're hoping to finish, we're about halfway into recording, and we're going on tour June 1st, a run through North America with Noel Gallagher. We're co-headlining with Noel, and we're very excited about that because we're Noel fans and Oasis fans, and he's like one of the best songwriters from the 90s, man. He wrote a lot of massive hits, really well constructed songs. And I met him a couple times before, and he's a cool dude. We met on some of the like K-Rock, Weenie Roast radio things back in the day. And Metric is playing with us. I'm a big fan of Metric too, Canadian band.
Yeah.
So that'll be cool. That runs in June and July. Then we're home in August, and we go to South America in September. We're playing some shows with the Foo Fighters, some big stadium shows and things. That'll be cool.
Great. Well, early on, I think the last record was finished in isolation, right? So this record, you all got in a room, and is that how this record was made?
Yeah, we started recording last fall, November into December. Our engineer Billy has a studio in Atwater, Red Razor, and we hole up there, and that's the 4 of us in the room, and Billy just records us jamming. And then we sort of take those jams and we'll start to edit them down into what we think is, this part's cool here. I really like what Shirley's saying here. And we'll take a 20-minute jam and edit it down to like 4 or 5 minutes and try to distill a song out of that. And we probably got about 14 or 15 songs like that are in various states of completion. And so I'm hoping, I'm pretty sure we'll go back in and finish it probably October, November. That's at least on the calendar for us. So, but I tell you, it was hard finishing a record in isolation.
Yeah,
I thought it would be easy. We were 95% done with the record when COVID hit, And, I guess, well, we won't see you guys, I guess, next week because we have to stay home. We're on lockdown. No one even knew what that meant or how long it was going to go on. And Shirley had a few vocals to finish, and I had some editing to do. Steve had a few guitars. And it was hard for all of us to sort of get motivated to do that on your own in lockdown. It went on for a couple months before we actually sort of buckled down and started finishing things. And
because Shirley had never really recorded on her own before, right? I mean, this was something new for everyone, I guess, that was sort of going through this.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it is, when you're used to recording in a room and you get feedback, that can be a very positive thing because it's when you're singing something in the right direction, or if it's criticism, you maybe dial that down or push it or go to a higher note, whatever. You're looking for feedback because you want to get the best performances you can. And when you're doing it by yourself, there's no one there to give you any feedback. And it was hard. And I think just the sort of the existential nature of being in isolation too. Like there were days where I didn't do any recording at all, even though I had a home studio. I would come down and sort of sit there and I just don't feel very motivated. So I'd go outside and take my dogs for a walk, And I'd wear a mask. I'd see people walking down the street. Do I need to wear a mask outside? I don't know. It was tripping everybody out, man.
Yeah. So and the last record, I feel like lyrically, it was a little bit political, right? I think No Gods, No Masters. So lyrically, is there a different place this record's coming from?
I don't know yet, but there's probably a couple themes and topics that resonate from No Gods that might trickle into this. I mean, surely part of it was watching the TV in isolation as she finished some of the lyrics and seeing how messed up the world is.
Yeah.
So it's definitely our most sort of social political album, and the world seems to be getting crazier and crazier. And I think she just felt like that's what she wanted to get off her chest, And there's a couple songs, like I said, on the new record that are sort of veering in that direction. But there's a couple songs sound like Pink Floyd on the new record, and some are strange pop songs. They're really hooky, but sort of strangely constructed in a way. It's hard to tell with a garbage record until we mix it, because a lot of the songs get final focus when we decide what to leave in or take out in the mix, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't actually play drums for like months between records, right? Sometimes
No.
years.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, when we finish a tour, I usually go dormant unless I need to play drums in the studio. And that's why I'm so sore today, Scott. We've just had 1 week of rehearsals, and it's like boot camp, man. We play about 5 hours. We go in and play on and off for 5 hours each day. I'm headed, after I leave the podcast booth here, I'm headed into the studio to rehearse. But I was sore yesterday, man.
You still find touring interesting?
Well, I love my band, and I love connecting with the audience. I don't really like the travel anymore. The grind. Yeah. We're lucky we get along. That we appreciate each other. We take the piss out of each other on tour. But we like to eat good food and go to restaurants. The last couple of years we went out, it was hard because we went out post-COVID, so we were in isolation on tour too.
Yeah.
We had no backstage guest list. We had to wear masks everywhere except on stage. And it sort of feels like you're in prison a little bit.
Wasn't a fun tour.
Well, it was fun to go out and play in front of people.
Right, of course.
But that's only like 10% of your day. The other 90%, you're getting your butt dragged from point A to point B. We have a great tour manager, Levi, too, who keeps everything very light.
Right.
He keeps it smooth, as we say. So, and honestly, we don't know how, we've been doing this for a long time. There's no guarantee how long we can keep doing it. So I think we're looking forward to this run this summer.
Yeah, people forget Garbage sold 17 million records. Pretty outstanding when you think about it, right? Incredible.
Kind of crazy. I wish we could still sell 17 million, but it's a little hard in the day of streaming.
Well, also, you are on an indie label now versus like the major early on for the first two records. Does things different for you now in terms of that, the way that records are marketed for you?
It seems easier in a way. Part of that is being at this point in our career, there's not the kind of pop pressure to be successful that we had when the first Garbage record sold 5 million copies out of the box, and then there was a lot of pressure on the records that happened after that, and we don't really feel that kind of pressure anymore. I mean, there's no way we're going to get played on Top 40 radio. We understand that. The label understands that.
Well, the K-Rocks, all the indie records.
We still get some airplay out, but it's like we're just going to do what we want to do, and that in a way is gratifying because it just allows us to let our freak flag fly.
Well, a couple questions, Butch, that I wanted to ask you that we ask everyone at the end of the show. So let me get into it with you. Butch Vig, the top 5 most underrated drummers of all time.
Oh, I thought about this, Scott, and just in our conversation here, I'm going to start with Steve Shelley from Sonic Youth.
Amazing drummer.
Amazing drummer. He doesn't get the accolades at all that he should be getting because he always fits within their sound. I remember in the studio mixing one of their songs, he told me to turn the drums down. Now, what drummer does that? Because he knew the drums are supposed to be sort of washy in the background. They're not supposed to be in the forefront. But he's great. He's really dynamic and intuitive, and he just fits in their music. They wouldn't sound like Sonic Youth if it wasn't for Steve Shelley's drumming. And a super cool dude, really one of the nicest guys, just a pleasure to work with in the studio.
Number 4.
I'm going to say Topper Headon from The Clash. I was listening to The Clash last night, and London Calling is probably in my top 5 albums of all time. I just love that record. Every song is great, and stylistically, it goes all over the place, and yet Topper's drumming glues it all together. He allowed that band to just stylistically play jazz and punk funk and cocktail music and pop ballads and straight up rock. And he's an unsung drummer. I think he's fantastic.
Yeah, I had a band the other day that I tried to play Train in Vain, and you realize it's actually a hard song to play. It's so simple, but it grooves like no one's business. So,
yeah.
Number 3.
I got to give one to the ladies. I'm going with Meg.
White Stripes.
White Stripes. Come on, man.
Yeah.
I know she got a lot of grief when the White Stripes came out because, honestly, some of the tracks are a little bit loose, but they feel good. And Jack knew that. He knew that the power of just that guitar and the drums, that there's a little bit of a cool, loose feel. It's human.
Yeah.
And yet it just, the grooves feel good, man. I saw him play 3 or 4 times right when they were taking off, too, and I just love her drumming. I love the way the two of them played together. So I got to give her some props.
So simple, but she grooves so hard. I agree with you. Number 2, top 5 most underrated drummers, Butch.
Well, I'm going to say Dom from the band Muse. Now, he's an incredible drummer. And again, to me, none of these guys are underrated. I think they're great, but he's not going to be talked about like John Bonham or
Dave
Grohl, people like that. But he's an incredible drummer.
Yeah, because you'd work with him.
He can play like I've worked with him. That's where I got to see him in the studio. Super nice guy. He can play these incredibly difficult parts, polyrhythmic. He's great at playing, executing drum fills. A lot like Neil Peart, he can play that kind of technical drumming, but he can also just groove like a mofo. Just play incredible. And I'm a huge Muse fan. I mean, they're their own beast. They kind of created their own sound.
People forget how huge they are in Europe, but here they're big too, but they're even bigger in Europe.
Yeah, they're a huge band, but Dom is a big part of that, and he's an incredible drummer.
And the number 1 most underrated drummer, according to Butch Vig.
One of my heroes, another drummer who I practice to, Mick Fleetwood.
Amazing.
Now, a lot of people don't consider his drumming that good because he doesn't play anything fancy. He just plays the simplest grooves, but those grooves are so perfect. You listen to a song, one of their big hits, Dreams. I dare a drummer to go in and play that groove perfect like that for 4 minutes.
I tried it. I couldn't do it.
It's so perfect, And I guess, I love drummers like that because I have a tendency to play pretty simple parts. I've never practiced drums. I think we talked about that a little bit at the start, that drumming is low on the totem pole for me. Songwriting, engineering, producing is more important to me. So when I play, I have a tendency to play pretty simple. But Mick's one of my heroes, man. I don't think you can get as understated as he plays and still make the groove really powerful.
I agree with you. There needs to be more attention from Mick Fleetwood. He was on the show, by the way, not long ago.
Right on.
Yeah. Great drummer. And one more question I want to ask before we go, and obviously check out the new Garbage record, the tour, everything Garbage related, the website. But the 5 most underrated rock albums, according to Butch Vig.
This is in my top 20 rock albums of all time. Goodbye Jumbo by World Party. I love the record. Carl Wallinger is the mastermind behind it. I think he played pretty much everything on that record. That album touches on songs that veer into Prince, Marvin Gaye, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones. There's Motown feel. The lyrics are great. He's a great singer. He's got a little bit of a Mick Jagger kind of yell to his voice, a little bit of a rasp. But I think he self-produced the record and played everything. There's not every song on the record is great. To me, it should have been a huge record at the time. And I think there was one single. Was it "Take a Message"? Take a message in the bottle. Dun, 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 dun. There was a song that was a single, but it didn't do very well over here. But I still listen to that record. It's great.
As soon as we leave here, I'm going to go check it out. By the way, I don't even know that record.
Yeah, it's great. Goodbye Jumbo. Yeah, the first song has a, and then my TV, I get to, I'm way down now. I'm way down now. And he starts going, hoo, 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 doing a little Rolling Stones thing at the end on the fade out of the song. You'll love it. It's a great record.
Amazing. Number 4, most underrated rock album.
Okay. First record that Topper played on, it's the Clash number 2, Give 'Em Enough Rope.
Great record.
And you're going to see a thread here, Scott.
Yeah.
That record didn't really do well here in the U.S. I think it did okay. It had a couple minor singles over in the UK. But I was a huge Clash fan. The first track on the record was it's really powerful. And I remember I got it at the time, and I looked at who produced it. And the producer is Sandy Pearlman. And Sandy Pearlman produced my next underrated record of all time, the lead-off debut album by Blue Oyster Cult.
Amazing.
I am a huge BOC fan. I'm telling you, I had all their records. We have a BOC playlist backstage at garbage shows. Like Steve Marker, our guitarist, is DJ Sloppy is the DJ, and every now and then he'll put a BOC playlist on, and everybody knows like Don't Fear the Reaper. They had a couple big records, and the record after that had Godzilla. That was also a big hit. But that first record has some killer songs, great guitar playing, great drumming, and Sandy Pearlman produced it, and I think he also co-wrote some of the lyrics.
I opened up for them in '87, but I will confess I really don't know that record, so I'll go back and listen to that record for sure. Number 2, most underrated rock album.
Also a debut album, the first album by Roxy Music. Now, I was the president of the Madison chapter of the Roxy Music Fan Club. Sure. We haven't had a meeting for a while, though. Since
Is there a meeting coming up?
Well, we could have one. I live out here in L.A. I'd have to get all the guys on Zoom. I was a huge Roxy fan. In fact, Paul Thompson, the drummer in that band, I could put him in my top 5 underrated drummers, too. I really love his drumming. Just an incredible force within the band, able to play a lot of different styles, but that first record is really what sort of defined Roxy as an art band. I mean, the songs are quite eclectic, and Eno's on the first 2 records. He's on the debut record. There's a lot of crazy synth on there. Brian Ferry's lyrics and his singing is really melodramatic and kind of over the top. And arrangement-wise, they just sound like they were from outer space. I just love that record.
Amazing. And the number 1 most underrated rock album according to Butch Vig.
New York Dolls debut album. I was blasting it last weekend.
Great choice.
And I can't remember, I didn't look at the credits on it, but was that produced by Todd Rundgren? I think Todd might have done maybe the first 2 records, but great pop songs. They were a band that should have been huge, and it just didn't happen. You know, they looked cool, wrote great songs. David Johansen is an incredible front man. I just saw a trailer for a documentary with how it looks great.
It was good. It was good. I mean, they don't get into as much of the doll stuff as they do his solo stuff. But I listen to Johnny Thunder's solo records all the time.
Yeah.
You Can't Put Your Arms Around a Memory.
It's great.
Incredible song.
Yeah. And an incredible band. They should have been huge. It was all there. They just looked fantastic, and then the record flopped. So there you go.
There you go, kids. The top 5 most underrated rock albums, according to Butch Vig. Butch, it was a pleasure. Check out Garbage on tour. The new record comes out when?
Don't have an exact release date yet. I'm guessing if we finish in October, November, it'll probably be out like in late February next year. So yeah, I'm guessing probably February.
We'll do a part 2 and part 3 coming up. It was a pleasure. And Brian and Nick, you're right. You're awesome. I appreciate you coming on.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Butch.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.